making its way with less help from the public purse.
The late running 710 Charing Cross service will be the next train at this platform.
It's early Monday morning at Gravesend Station in Kent. Passengers are waiting for the next rush hour train to London. It's running late.
Train at this platform is the late running 710 Charing Cross service. Fasten up.
Almost 500,000 people now rely on British Rail to get to work in London on one of the world's most congested commuter systems. 5 years of growth has made rail a market leader, carrying 4 out of every 10 of the capital's commuters. The fact that investment in the network hasn't kept pace is only too obvious on the North Kent line. Packed into 30-year-old rolling stock, passengers pay some of the highest fares in Europe for a service they despise.
Trains never arrive on time, never. I mean, if you catch the same train every morning, a pound to a penny, it's not going to arrive at its destination at the time it should.
You never get a seat. I pay over 1,000 in fares to stand up.
I don't think it's conducive to a good atmosphere to work in London when you've got people who are going to have to stand for 45 minutes and then they've got to look forward to the same situation on the way home.
If you could park in London, yes, I would drive in. Save doing this every day.
In the face of growing customer dissatisfaction with the service, British Rail management and the government point to a dramatic improvement in the network's financial performance in recent years. Ministers have gone a long way in weaning BR off the public purse, and the railway appeared to be undergoing a radical transformation from public service to commercial business. But progress on that has been halted by the current economic downturn. British Rail's financial targets look increasingly difficult to achieve, and the cash squeeze is posing a threat both to levels of service and future investment. The Conservatives' determination to privatise British Rail is behind government pressure on BR to meet ever more demanding financial targets. But at last month's party conference, delegates were uneasy about the government's handling of rail, despite a jump in investment to nearly £2 billion over the past 3 years.
So much for the nonsense that we're against public transport. We may be against the public ownership of transport, but that's, I'm sure we'll all agree, quite a different thing.
But according to the secretary of the official rail users watchdog body, Michael Patterson, the pace of current investment still isn't fast enough to make up for decades of neglect. It's part of his job to monitor whether rail services meet the quality targets set by the government.
To achieve good quality of service standards requires further investment by British Rail in more rolling stock, particularly to ease the overcrowding situation. That cash is not there at the moment, and I do fear that pressure to achieve financial targets could make the situation even worse in terms of achieving the quality standards, because the evidence seems to suggest that when British Rail has a choice between meeting financial targets and quality targets, the financial targets win every time.
British Rail began adopting a more commercial approach in 1982 with the creation of new business sectors. Intercity took on the long-distance routes. Network South East was responsible for services around the capital. Provincial was to serve the needs of rail travellers in the regions. Each of the new business sectors must work to strict financial targets set by the government. Since 1983, BR's total subsidy, known as the Public Service Obligation or PSO grant, has virtually halved from over £1.2 billion to £600 million. Intercity no longer receives any grant. At the same time, the railway has carried a steadily growing number of people, with total passenger miles up from 16 to 21 billion. With revenue up and the workforce trimmed, BR can claim to be the world's most cost-effective railway.
It's an enormous improvement in cost effectiveness, achieved by different routes in different businesses. 5 years ago, when I became Intercity Director, our losses were 25% of our turnover. If we projected our plans, we didn't really see any ways of getting losses below £100 million a year. We've now been in profit for 2 years, and quite significant profit as well, and we can see our ways of moving forward to increase profits in the future.
Increased labour productivity has been a key factor in helping British Rail turn itself around. 25,000 jobs have been shed from the workforce in the past 7 years. Those remaining on the payroll are working more efficiently. Recent investment in new, more sophisticated technology has streamlined BR's engineering operations. And the gradual replacement of old rolling stock with more reliable modern trains has pushed down maintenance costs. There's no doubt that productivity gains have helped British Rail improve its overall financial performance. But there's been another and perhaps more important factor at work that's enabled BR to survive the squeeze on its public subsidy, and it's little or nothing to do with running a railway. Throughout the 1980s property boom, British Rail cashed in by selling off valuable land assets to developers. British Rail's property board has become a major source of additional finance, taking full advantage of a buoyant market to boost sales and rents. In the past 3 years, it contributed close to £1 billion to the railways, funding investment and compensating for reductions in government grants. But the property slump has cut this year's expected income by more than a third.
We are forecasting a shortfall of about 125 million in total cash receipts. I shall be most pleased if we bring it in at that. All of our plans were predicated on maintaining the contribution. So the property market has taken a dive. We don't know when it's going to come back. So future financial planning from property, I think, will have to be reconsidered this autumn.
That planning can't include many more large-scale developments like this one at Broadgate in the City of London. Available railway land is limited, and already virtually every major London rail terminus has been redeveloped. With property no longer the pot of gold that it was, BR is being forced to rely more heavily on its rail operations to achieve its financial targets. The Yorkshire Pullman service between London and Leeds, a highly successful example of Intercity's aggressive marketing approach to achieving its target of increased profitability. Premium products like this offer passengers a well-staffed service on board one of the most modern trains running in Britain.
Enjoy breakfast.
Aimed principally at the business traveller, passengers pay over £100 for a round trip of just 400 miles.
There we go, sir. Thank you.
Quality of service is obviously at the very heart of the Pullman marketing concept. Yet, ironically, Intercity no longer has quality of service objectives imposed on it by the government in the way that Network South East and Provincial still do. That's because it no longer receives a public subsidy. Intercity has come up with its own modest targets for punctuality, which it's so far failed to achieve. But it's refused to set itself firm goals to reduce overcrowding.
I'm still very dissatisfied with the performance standards we're achieving, and we're taking a lot of steps to try and push them further. Some of those actually depend on equipment. We need equipment which is a lot more reliable than some of the older equipment we've got now if we're going to achieve the sort of standards that I want to achieve.
But those planned improvements are under pressure. Following years of growth on the back of a booming economy, the recession has brought a slowdown in revenue as people travel less. Intercity has already hiked fares by up to 60% over its last 3 increases. And with just a 5% share of long-distance travel in the UK, it must take care not to price itself out of the market.
In the leisure market, there is no doubt that people will resist quite strongly if fares go very much above inflation. In the business market and in the travel to work market, certainly people will divert away from railways if fares are pushed too hard. The businessman will, of course, go to the company car, which is subsidised. The person travelling to work will begin to relocate either his work or his home, and the market will begin to drop away.
But Intercity isn't constrained only by how far it can raise fares. The government, which is effectively banker to the railways, sets strict limits on how much BR can borrow each year. That's left Intercity management in doubt about the funding of investment they regard as essential to improving profits.
The constraints are whether the board and the government will give me the money that I asked for. I mean, that's where it boils down to. I'm quite satisfied that I can make a reasonable case for the investments I think we need.
But you can't be certain of getting the money for the projects you want to go ahead with.
There's no certainty in this world.
Isn't it difficult to operate a commercial business in the way that you're trying to do in that sort of straitjacket, if you like?
Well, I mean, it's a straitjacket that I'm used to, and I suppose I've got to the stage where it fits quite comfortably.
Is it fair to say then that there are now serious question marks over the targets that are enshrined in British Rail's last corporate plan?
There was always a possibility that they would have to be revised. I mean, targets are targets, and they're never anything more than that.
Hornsey Rail Depot in North London. It's a prize-winning example of how better productivity has helped Network South East achieve its financial targets with a declining public subsidy. A staff of 100 work around the clock here, cleaning and maintaining the Great Northern Fleet, which runs between the Cambridgeshire commuter belt and London. Changes in work practices introduced by local management have had a clear payback in terms of the depot's performance.
In the last 3 years or so, we've been able to increase the number of trains we maintain here from about 80 to a number approaching 120, with about the same number of staff. The prime reason for that is that we've improved staff versatility, staff flexibility, and in fact their productivity.
Can you go much further with that flexibility of working that you've established here?
I think in my judgment, we're working about as flexibly as is practically possible.
Increased productivity at depots like Hornsey has been matched on board the trains they maintain. New working practices brought in during the 1980s saw the introduction of flexible rostering, improved staff training, the removal of a second man from the cab and one-man operation. One of the main people responsible for those reforms was Tom Greaves, for 8 years head of train crew at BR's headquarters. Now a consultant to railways in Britain and Europe, he's pessimistic about the scope for further gains in labour productivity.
There's little more if you're looking at the key areas of train crew, which are a very large proportion of the industry's labour force. From 83 to 88, 89, there were 4 very significant productivity developments which took British Railways from the bottom of the productivity table compared to our European colleagues to virtually the top. Now, there are 1 or 2 minor issues, but nothing of significance such as there was in the 83 to 88 period.
Some key areas of BR's operations are now facing problems in the wake of past productivity gains. Here in South London, signals engineers are carrying out vital work on new tracks, linking the Channel Tunnel with the capital. The man in charge of this and other projects throughout southern England says he doesn't have enough staff to do the job.
My problem in the south is shortage of engineers at all levels. Given the very high level of investment we now face with Channel Tunnel and other strategic projects, we simply are struggling to find the engineers necessary to carry out that work. We did spend considerable time in the 80s reducing those numbers of engineers, and we're very much paying the price for that now.
Broken? Yep. Right, going back in.
To recruit and retain the skilled staff it lacks, BR is having to address the problem of low pay, which developed during the 1980s efficiency drive. It's already negotiating a new deal on wages and conditions.
That inevitably means more costs for you, doesn't it?
Yes, and we shall have to face up to that.
Who's going to pick up the tab for that?
At the end of the day, the user will pay the cost of his journey, and it does mean that the cost of rail travel will rise a little bit.
Revenue on Network South East is also a victim of the economic slowdown, pushing its target of operating without subsidy beyond the timescale laid down by the government. To reach it at all, customers must brace themselves for fare increases well beyond inflation.
I don't think Network South East can beat the economy. If the economy goes up, we should go up with it, and we should come out of grant. Of course, we want to earn our way out of grant through more income. If the economy is going to take a long time recovering, we should take a long time getting out of grant. At the moment, you pay about 90% of your costs when you travel on a Network South East train. If we're going to get it to 100% or better, people do have to pay the true cost of their journey.
Loss-making trains like this one running between Cambridge and Peterborough make Provincial BR's most heavily subsidised operation. Fares cover roughly 1/3 of running costs. The government accepts that subsidies are needed for social reasons, but the squeeze on the amount available is prompting regional managers to cut some trains from the timetable in a controversial reassessment of how BR meets a social need.
Social need does fit in, but there is also a commercial angle to it. You have to take both issues on board in planning the services and looking at their finances, because they do perform a social role. That is why we receive a grant from central government. But in performing that social role, it's not an unending social role, and it has to look at the economics of serving every aspect of it. And there are some that we feel that are just not sufficiently high in terms of social priority and their value for money.
Now BR is seeking others to finance marginal services. It asked the county council to pay the cost of keeping the last train of the day running on this line between Cambridge and Peterborough. Although some local authorities have agreed similar requests for funding, Cambridgeshire was infuriated by the suggestion.
We feel it was quite iniquitous, really, that British Rail should be being paid twice, really, for the same service. I mean, they're being funded by central government to provide socially necessary services. But then, on the other hand, they were turning around to the county and other counties like ourselves and saying, well, how about paying for this service?
British Rail bids for extra local funding are now meeting wider resistance. The Association of County Councils has recommended their rejection. The concern is shared by the National Rail Users Group.
We think that's a very regrettable procedure for British Rail to adopt. If they haven't got sufficient money to operate a public service broadly in line with what it was before, then they really must go back to government and say so. They really mustn't be going to the local authorities and putting them over a barrel and saying, you know, we withdraw your trains unless you provide us with more money. That's what the PSO grant is provided for. And if it's not big enough, if it's not adequate, then British Rail must say so.
There's already clear evidence that British Rail's pursuit of increasingly tough financial targets in an economic downturn is denting the service it can offer. Rail consumer bodies fear a widespread round of service cuts next spring. Network South East says it's already chopped station modernisation plans to ribbons. And here at Maze Hill in suburban London, staff are finishing work early, even though the rush hour is still in full swing. It's part of a cost-saving programme at dozens of stations throughout the region. There's growing concern that the travelling public will have to pay a bigger price still if BR's to realise its financial targets.
They could only be attained by making the service worse, very much worse, and very much more expensive. I think you would be looking at fares in the London area going up very substantially indeed, and on the intercity journeys which are coming into London. And I don't believe that people would almost stand for it. I believe it probably is politically impossible to have that sort of level of fares increase. So I think there is this inconsistency between the money available, either from fares or grant, and what the public expect.
Shouldn't you, at this stage, be going back to the government and saying, look, we cannot work with a reducing PSO, we must stop that process and perhaps even reverse it?
I think we should be very frank with government. We should not be frank in the glare of a television camera. We should be frank in the privacy of a committee room. But we should be telling them very frankly where we stand, what is achievable and what isn't. And if there's going to be a tension between the quality standards and the finance in the short term, and I think we're talking 2 or 3 years in this situation, we should say so.
But so far, the government hasn't relaxed BR's financial targets. The Chancellor's recent autumn statement gave British Rail extra money for essential safety measures, but made no provision for any real increase in subsidy. And BR say they're being allowed to invest less than they'd wanted, forcing them to consider postponing some improvement projects. For transport economists like Kerry Hamilton, British Rail is still only catching up on an investment backlog, rather than expanding the network to take advantage of the expected growth in traffic over the next decade.
British Rail are carrying 7% of the nation's freight, and they're carrying 7% of the nation's passengers. Now, if we look back to the 50s and 60s, it was well in excess of 20%. So actually, they're working very, very hard just to stand still. What actually is required is the laying of new lines, because you can't get the passengers through and you can't get the freight through on the lines that there are. So you need a massive investment in British Rail to have an increase in British Rail's capacity.
We already have some of the most congested tracks in Europe, and I think we're going to find ourselves entering a new era where the existing infrastructure just was not laid out for the number of people we're trying to bring into London. That points towards more tracks, but it's going to mean big investment. That sort of investment cannot possibly be covered in the sort of numbers we've been talking about so far.
Major investment like that is simply beyond the resources of British Rail, especially when it's struggling to live within its means. That's the problem ministers will have to confront soon if they're to satisfy public pressure for a railway service that can cope with the demands of the 21st century.